KIGF. And thank you all for joining us. We have a really interesting panel here today to discuss algorithmic transparency. I'm really excited to introduce Natalia Domagala, who's the head of data ethics policy at the Cabinet Office, Ashley Casovan, who's the executive director of AI Global, and Millie Zimeta, who's the head of public policy at the Open Data Institute. We had hoped to have Brent Mittelstadt from the OII joining us as well, but he's had to pull out at the last minute because of a clash. So lucky you audience get an all-female wonderful women panel today to discuss this really interesting and important topic. And it couldn't come at a better time. We in the UK, we've seen in the last weeks, I think about in the last month or so, we've seen 3 major public sector algorithms being called into question and ultimately being walked away from. So we had the Home Office visa streaming tool, which was abandoned. We had the West Midlands Police Ethics Board decide against deploying an data analytics solution. And of course, we saw the A-levels grading algorithm that was ultimately sidelined. And around those 3 incidences with respect to algorithmic systems, we've seen a lot of public commentary and questioning about what it means to have algorithms involved in decision making and in particular deployed by public sector entities. And we're also seeing some reporting that local councils across the country are quietly abandoning algorithmic systems that they're using for risk scoring and the delivery of public services. And this is coming at a time when one would have hoped we would have been able to harness algorithmic systems and other technologies to address some of the major challenges we face. And in fact, we have seen some real successes with data analytics being deployed in the context of COVID. The NHS, for example, has set up a major data analytics solution to process operations data. The Alan Turing Institute, in partnership with HDR UK and the NHS, have launched the D-COVID project, which is trying to use health data to develop real-time responses to the pandemic. And there's clearly a lot of scope in the health sector to begin with for using algorithms in a really beneficial way, and arguably beyond that. But at the same time, we have these kind of high-profile missteps, or at least deployments that have been critiqued quite widely. And so I think we're at an interesting turning point in public trust in algorithmic systems, at least in the UK. And we really need to stop and take stock of what more needs to be done to repair that public trust that has been arguably damaged. It's certainly in the context of the A-levels algorithm, which caused such widespread public outcries. And how can we increase public trust in algorithmic systems? That's the big question on everyone's lips, I think. So transparency has long been talked about as being part of the puzzle for solving this problem. And those of us who attend conferences like this regularly will know that it's very easy to pay lip service to how important transparency is in the development and deployment of AI and algorithmic systems. But what does it actually mean, and how can we make it a reality? I think that moving beyond lip service into practice has proved quite challenging. And there doesn't yet seem to be consensus on what that looks like. How do we put transparency into practice in a meaningful way? There's been much discussion of different types of tools and methodologies that can be used. So we hear talk a lot of algorithmic impact assessments, but I think there's still a lot to be understood about what they mean and what's best practice look like. There have been organizations such as Algorithm Watch, which have been pushing for mandatory disclosure of algorithmic systems in the public service and the establishment of a public register of algorithmic systems, but this hasn't yet taken hold. And then I think one step back, we can also imagine procurement processes and transparency around procurement processes being an important part of the puzzle as well. But all of these are mostly discussion points and not yet put into reality. And I think there's a big question about which direction we should go in now to really make algorithmic transparency a reality. So to start off the discussion, I'm going to invite Natalia, who, as I said, is the head of data ethics policy at the Cabinet Office, to set up the issue from the perspective of the government. So to talk us through what is the direction of travel when it comes to algorithmic transparency from where the government stands, and how does the recently published national data strategy approach this area, and given the minister's keynote this morning, what do we know about the national digital strategy and how it's thinking about algorithmic transparency? So Natalia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kylie. So I would like to start with an attempt to situate algorithmic transparency within the broader institutional context. And algorithmic transparency is a multidisciplinary area at the intersection of open data and transparency policies and data ethics. And in the UK, we've been lucky enough to have this long-standing, really strong movement of the open data community. And we have our open by default policy introduced in 2012. We also have the data ethics work that we started in 2016 with the data ethics framework, when it first came out as the data science ethics framework. And to me, this proactive transparency in the use of algorithms that we are aiming towards will be an organic extension of these two policy areas. And having such strong foundations, like in the case of the UK, should, one would hope, be helpful in building meaningful algorithmic transparency tools. And the current situation is that the tools such as the data ethics framework or the guide to using AI in the public sector that was produced in collaboration with the Alan Turing Institute, alongside other guidance that we have, so specific procurement or health guidance, are available to support the ethical and safe use of algorithms in the public sector. And we do know that we need to go a step further, and we need to, building on this existing work and what we currently have on algorithmic and data ethics, we need to now explore the development of appropriate and effective mechanisms to really deliver transparency on the use of algorithms in decision-making within the public sector. And this is what we are committing to doing in the recently published National Data Strategy. And the strategy is now open for comments for the next 12 weeks. So I do strongly encourage all of you to take part in this consultation, because it will really strongly shape our thinking in this area. And I would also like to begin this discussion by giving some background on our recent data ethics work in the UK, particularly in the context of the data ethics framework. So the framework, as some of you might know, because it's been around for 4 years now, the purpose is to guide appropriate and responsible data use in governments and the wider public sector. And the idea is that the framework will help public servants understand ethical considerations, address ethical considerations in their projects, and also encourage responsible innovation. And I'm actually very pleased to announce that this morning we have launched the updated version of the data ethics framework, so we can see it on gov.uk now. It was originally launched in 2016. It was actually one of the first tools of its kind, so we're still very proud of it. And we updated it first in 2018, and now we've just finalized this process. And at this point, you're probably wondering, why am I bringing up the data ethics framework? But we're supposed to talk about algorithmic transparency here. But I think all of this is to illustrate the point that algorithmic transparency is not a new idea that suddenly came out of nowhere, but it has organically emerged from this intersection of transparency and data ethics. And I think in order to get it right, we need to understand its foundations. And I'm very happy to share some of my learnings from the process of refreshing the data ethics framework, which we've recently gone through. But I might save it for the later part of this panel, because I'd like to get other panelists' takes on the issue as well.
Thanks, Natalia. Before you move on, can you tell us a little bit about what's changed in the data ethics framework?
Absolutely. So the changes are not as groundbreaking as you might expect, but basically the key changes include that we split the previously 7 principles into overarching principles that apply to every stage of the work. So these are transparency, accountability, and fairness. And we have specific actions that have been reordered to reflect the project cycle. So the aim here was to make the framework more effective and easier for data scientists to follow in their process. So before we had 7 principles that were kind of all equal, and in the feedback process during the refresh that we ran for the past few months, there was a strong need identified that we need to separate some of the principles that apply to absolutely every single stage of the process.
My apologies, I was muted. That's interesting to hear. You also said that you recognize that the government recognizes that it needs to go further now to develop and provide tools to aid those deploying algorithms in the public sector. Can you speak a little bit about what types of tools you might have in mind, and is that part of the data ethics framework, or is that a separate initiative?
So this is something we're still working on now, and I can't give any more details at this point. But any kind of suggestions for what kind of tools have proven successful in similar circumstances will be really, really welcome. And also, the National Data Strategy Consultation is a space to have this discussion with civil society and academia as well.
Okay. Thank you. Well, that sets us up well to move on to Ashley. Ashley, perhaps you could start by telling us a bit about AI Global and the work that you do there, but we're really interested to hear about, in particular, your expertise in developing these types of tools like algorithm audits or impact assessments, and what you've found successful, effective, and where you think best practice is heading in this field.
Great, thanks. And thanks so much for having me. And I think it's really interesting to hear what Natalia is talking about in terms of data. Like, why are you talking about data as part of algorithms? Obviously, that's a huge concern and component of it. But I do think that when we're talking about AI systems more broadly, and even then really thinking about what we're talking about related to AI is a constant struggle, and I don't set out to define it here either on this panel or in my work at all. But I do think it's important to know what we're talking about when we're having these conversations about different types of tools that are being monitored. And you spoke about them at the beginning, Carly. I think it was a great way to position some of the examples. And I'm really, really happy to see that the UK is taking seriously this idea of actually having reviews and not proceeding with some systems just because they don't align with either values, or else they need more understanding of how they actually work. And so these are the types of things that we're actually looking for, not just when we're moving beyond kind of the principles that are out there. Natalia mentioned transparency. Some of the stuff that we look for, and I know this has been also in the data strategy as well, is looking at accountability. And so what that overall process is and who's involved in making sure that there's various different inputs that are going into that system, whether those be risk accountability frameworks that already exist in a lot of the work that we do, or just looking at what the governance mechanisms are. Then we also look at explainability and interpretability, data quality, bias fairness, and robustness. So these are the different types of things that I've been concerned about, not just from an AI global perspective, but my previous role as Director of Data and Digital for the Government of Canada. So I'll probably just start there in the introduction. And one other thing that you mentioned at the beginning was that kind of question is, how can we increase trust in public algorithms? And that was the mission that we set out to do. And I mentioned my title was actually data and digital. And so my background really started in the open data community and had transitioned into looking at what types of tools and policies we need for the oversight of enterprise data. And so similarly, we did a data strategy roadmap and kind of looked at all of these impacts that these tools would have. And which again is why I situate what is it that we're actually talking about when we talk about algorithms, because it's actually not just the algorithms, it's the data and the other inputs, including that process that goes into the system. So recognizing that all of these concepts were really combined, I was very nervous to take on the role of doing policy work for for artificial intelligence and thought that I had no business doing that. But actually my first day on the job, I was on a panel, which was also more scary, and realized that all the questions were about data. And I was like, I got this. Right? They're really related to how we govern and manage data. And so I guess with a bit more renewed confidence in that, and also the fact that we had other experts on the team thinking about the ethics behind these systems, and then also the legal components of this work and the implications that it has on laws. And often we think about, when we're thinking about ethics, human rights laws, but it really goes beyond that. So I'll get to more of these details in a second, but just to situate further, what I've been doing is, within that capacity, we launched the first national government policy framework called the Directive on Automated Decision-Making Systems. And that's the less known title to most people's knowledge of the algorithmic impact assessment, but those two tools actually work together. So the algorithmic impact assessment was a best practice that AI Now and other types of organizations were talking about doing. That said, what we used it for was really to understand what the risk of the system was. And this is why I started by saying we need to understand what we're talking about, because the scope of AI is very, very large. And that's why we focused on automated decision-making systems specifically. And from that, what we decided to do was not treat them all the same. And so the algorithmic impact assessment looks at data and accountability and the other components that I mentioned earlier. And it assesses them based on what their risk would be. And then the directive has scalable requirements from that. And these are the types of things that really work in a system where you have oversight, like the UK government or the Canadian government. But in general, when we're talking about the use of these tools in systems that don't have oversight functions, it's really difficult to know how to even compare what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, which is why I really started to think about who does manage those conversations and questions, so that it's not just discrete activities that are happening within the UK context or within the Canadian context or the American context, because these tools are being used without those kind of borders that we've created. So that's where I decided to step into the nonprofit sector, and now I'm the executive director of AI Global. And our work there is really trying to focus on building off of not only the lessons learned that I had within the Canadian context, but really advancing those ideas of trying to put not only share the tools and knowledge that exists. I think that's a huge first step, and we can come back to that. But then also just creating those audits and having them publicly available, so that it's setting anybody that's building these systems, whether you're a lawyer that's involved in the team or the actual technician or engineer on the team, up for success. So that means either working together, or, as Natalia was saying, I really like that you've staged your principles throughout the life cycle, and making sure that there's an audit or assessment of that throughout. And so the work that we're doing, and we've released publicly, is an open source tool called the Responsible AI Design Assistant, that's looking at all of those factors that I mentioned. And it's an online questionnaire in the same way that the algorithmic impact assessment was. But because of that kind of broader concept of it not just being about algorithms, that we really need to look at the data and the models and the processes, that it reviews all of those things. And so it has a more fitting title in my mind. And what it's based on, and the whole objective around it, is that question on trust and public trust, and how do we increase that? And a lot of those pieces, we built this tool, as I said, not just from my Canadian experience, but looking at what all of those various different principles, policies, tools, and are available, and how do you actually take those and then evaluate them. And so that's the work that I'm continuing to do in that sector, and serving a broader audience than just one nation and one kind of community.
Well, it's super interesting work, and there's so much to unpack in what you just said there. One question, and I've got a few more that I'll come back to you after Millie speaks, but you said that when you were designing the algorithmic impact assessment system with Canada, which of course has become the kind of global standard, and certainly was a leader in national algorithmic impact assessments. You said you focused on automated decision-making systems.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how challenging you found it then, and you continue to find it now, to define the system that you're looking at as an automated decision-making system as opposed to something else. One of the things that we found at the Lovelace Institute around transparency, algorithmic transparency, is there's a wide variety of names used for what these systems are, whether they're advanced data analytics, whether they're assisted decision-making, automated decision-making, are they AI? And that sometimes that impedes transparency. And I'll give you an example. The Data Justice Lab at the University of Cardiff did a really excellent report where they used freedom of information requests to try to understand where automated or assisted decision-making systems were being used throughout the UK local authorities. And they didn't get a lot of responses to those FOIs, but the responses they did get, the respondees included in systems really across a very wide spectrum. So whereas we maybe are talking about, for example, risk scoring algorithms, which identify particular vulnerable communities who are in receipt of homelessness benefits, for example, some local authorities responded by including like a telephone system, which automatically like directed people to certain, you know, departments. And so and there are many experts participating in this audience, we all understand that like automation and technology spans such a wide gamut from very simple things to very complex things. I think we're probably all talking about the more complex things when we talk about the need for transparency. But how did you overcome that definitional hurdle, or did you kind of just duck it and allow people to define it as they see fit?
Well, we didn't make any friends in this process, I can tell you that. But yes and no, actually. So we defined it with anything that was automated. So that telephone system fits into the scope, or it would fit into the scope if it was created after the date that we had set. And so that was kind of how one of the things that we did to mitigate there being a plethora of applications that now needed to retroactively go through it. So two quick things. We gave a year heads up to say this policy is going to go into effect in a year from now. But anything created after the date of it being released. So it was April 1st, 2019, and then it went into effect on April 1st, 2020. So anything created between or after April 1st, 2019 would have to be included in that. And yes, it was that broad scope and there was a lot of debate around whether or not we should call it directive on AI. And it was called that in draft for a very long time. And I didn't mention this, but I think it is important, and we'll get to it later, that one of these tenants, and I'm happy to see the UK is doing it, is releasing it publicly. So we built this entirely in the open. And so people were probably watching like, why is the name changing? And that was one of the biggest pieces of contention was what does that mean? And what we were concerned about was, as you mentioned, that broad definition becomes a really big problem. So we were concerned that we, as a very small team of 3 people, would need to keep a running log of systems that fit into that. And so instead, by defining it in the broadest sense and saying if there is any automated component, then it would be subject to this policy. But what's important to know is that, again, that scaling of the algorithmic impact assessment precludes then something that's a telephone system that doesn't have a lot of risk associated with it without having too much additional requirements put on it. And the other thing is that when actually looking at what was the net new activity that was required to be compliant with this policy, really only the systems that had learning components in it would be subject to net new oversight. So testing and training of a system is already something that should be done. And these were 2 of the 9 requirements that we had. And that was why when I said that we didn't make a lot of friends is automatically departments think like, oh, there's another policy and we now need to do more work to comply. And so it was really important for me to make a mapping of saying through IT policy or through governance mechanisms, you already need to do these things. And we had very few, and we tried to mitigate the amount of additional work that was required. And so by scaling it, those provisions, it allowed us to not ask for too much more unless it was a high risk system. So probably like the Midlands Police example, where then you have to have more, not only oversight, but then things like notification of the system or third-party review was required at that point in time. But a small application like the telephone example would have already probably should have gone through all of the requirements that we were requesting within that directive.
That's really interesting. And we might come back to Natalia on that later, which is some arguments here are that most of what should be covered by an algorithmic impact assessment should be covered by a data protection impact assessment, and which is already required in law, as you point out, Ashley. So it's an interesting question about like what additional factors do we need to be, or additional responsibility should we be putting on deployers of these systems. If I can move the I just muted myself while talking. You think I'd be better used to this by now, having done 7 billion panels during COVID lockdown? Apologies for that. I'm going to move now to, thank you very much, Ashley. I'm going to move now to Millie. Millie is the head of public policy at the Open Data Institute. And so we're going to turn to her to shift the conversation slightly to address what Ashley alluded to a little in her intervention around the need for transparency to focus on data as well as the algorithms themselves and the models themselves. So Millie, we're interested to hear from you. How should we be thinking about data when it comes to algorithmic transparency? And we've got quite a few questions in the Q&A which focus on bias in particular and bias in data. And I'm wondering if you could maybe address that in your remarks about how we should think about transparency as a cure or a way to mitigate bias in data sets which are used to train AI and algorithms. And do we have you, Millie? We've got no video and you're on mute. So I'm hoping that you've just forgotten to turn them on. Millie has frozen. Let's give Millie a couple of minutes. I wanted to ask Ashley another question anyway, if that's all right, which was, well, I guess a kind of relatively simple question. The Canadian directive came into force in April. Do we know anything yet about numbers of assessments undertaken, any type of impact or kind of effect of having the system in place?
I don't work there anymore.
No,
so
of course you don't. Of course you don't.
Yeah, so I don't know.
Yeah, okay, sure.
But it was smaller when I was still there. I left in September of last year, so we didn't have a high amount at that time. But definitely, Natalie McGee is the person that you want to ask these questions to. But I think that from what I've seen, departments are starting to get more used to it. And
yeah.
One of the things that you were talking about earlier is the need for procurement. And so we tried to attach that to our procurement life cycle as well, which then I think would require the need for it. And I know that having worked with some vendors as well, that they were familiar with the fact that an algorithmic impact assessment and therefore the policy needed to be followed. So I think from that perspective, at least, there was knowledge and awareness, and that probably a lot of that work in doing that assessment would follow to those vendors. So it was good, at least, that they were familiar with it. I could say that.
Yeah, that's useful. Thank you. And sorry to put you on the spot.
No.
Given that you don't work there anymore. It looks like we have Millie back now. Can you hear us, Millie?
Yes. Thanks, and apologies, Carly. So it seems to it's been freezing intermittently. Let's hope it doesn't do it again.
Sure. Great.
Yes.
Well, happy to turn over to you now that we've got you back.
Great. So thank you for the introduction. So I should say that I'm a philosopher by training, and so I'm going to approach this quite philosophically, and maybe try to offer some provocations that invite us to us as the panelists and the audience to maybe think about the implications of some ways of framing or conceptualizing both the opportunity and the challenge. So algorithms are built from data, and Carly, as you mentioned, if the data isn't right, if there's kind of gaps in the data or bias in the data, then that's going to affect the algorithm that's built of that. But at the ODI, we take a slightly broader view and think, well, even if the data is perfect and complete, that doesn't mean you're going to get a perfect outcome or a perfect answer. So we try not to be sort of tech utopian or tech solutionist, and recognize that the importance of humans in kind of defining the kind of society that we want and also building it. So a good analogy might be that data is infrastructure, and there are if you think about transport infrastructure, it's the physical roads, but it's also the vehicles on the roads. It's also all the legislation that allows us to drive safely, that allows us to cross roads safely, and also to have a map to know where we're going to and how to get there. So transport system is not just the physical road, but all the behaviours and institutions and shared understandings around it. And we take the same view of data. Data is infrastructure, nationally or internationally. And that has 4 implications for algorithms that are built off the back of that data, for them to be effective tools, sustainable tools, for them to have competent users, and for them to be in trusted systems. So I'll go through those one at a time. So for a tool to be effective, or for an algorithmic tool to be effective, we think that the model itself needs to be open, the data going into the model needs to be open, and the analysis or insight that comes out of that application should be open. And this is the essence of the scientific method and reproducible research, because it allows ideas to be tested, it allows them to be scrutinized, validated. It allows for any biases in, say, the research team to be mitigated by having other eyes, external eyes, look at it. It allows any kind of limitations on the analysis to be spotted so that it can be improved and developed. And it also means that, if a different solution can be found that's perhaps more efficient, or, allows for more different kinds of uses afterwards, that can be generated by having a kind of an open model that other people can work with and see. So that's how you make your tools more effective, by working with an open model. We also think that the tools should be sustainable, not just in the kind of environmental sense, but if you think about what infrastructure is, it's got to be adaptable for future uses that we can't even imagine, and ideally for different kinds of uses in the present, not just for one use. So how do you do that with algorithms? So we think that one way to do that is through data standards. So kind of introducing ways of kind of recording data so that there's consistency in record keeping. So for example, if you have an address book on your phone and an address book on your computer, that you use the same kind of column names, first name, surname, email address, phone number, and that allows them to be compatible with each other, right? So we've got shared standards. Another aspect of that might be data interoperability. And that means that different frameworks for data management can sort of be compatible with each other. So for example, if you had some of your contacts in a physical address book, that's not necessarily compatible with your electronic files. So there you can't kind of reconcile the 2 sets of records and find someone who you're looking for, or send out party invitations. So it's again thinking about data, about the usability of that data for different uses. And I guess in Britain, we're seeing some of those challenges around incompatibility between, say, local government records and central government records, or between, I don't know, say, health records and kind of, I guess, service needs, which has kind of slowed down the response in public service delivery. Another aspect for allowing data to be used in new ways in the future that we can't anticipate yet is the legislation or the regulation around that, which kind of supports innovation, but also protects the public from possible harms. And if your legislation is very slow and clunky to work with, that's going to slow down our response or our capacity to innovate. But at the same time, those protections should remain, for the public. And a good way of reconciling sort of innovation, but that kind of duty of care. The FCA are doing some really interesting thing with sandpits. So they're kind of experimental places where you can test the regulation, see what you can and can't do with it, but also for the technical community to develop confidence in their understanding of the regulation, to point out errors with it and that sort of thing. So you've got to think about tools that you can use to support that dual aspect of legislation and regulation. So on the consideration of competent users, So infrastructure is not just the data itself, but the people who are working on it. So consider the analytical skills of the team. Are they asking the right questions? Are they applying the analysis with intelligence? And that's not just that kind of mathematical intelligence, but say emotional intelligence or political intelligence about the impacts of their work, or to be able to critique the assumptions that they're bringing to the way the model has been framed. You need a diversity of skills. You need data scientists, but you need data engineers. You need people with domain knowledge, that's understanding of the field itself. You need people with non-data skills who can help with the engagement with communities. And you also need socially diverse teams to bring those critical perspectives on the work that's being done. So again, it's not just about the data, it's about the people around the data. They're a really key part of the equation. And further than that, if you think about the people around the data, there's the community itself, the citizens, right? So, I mean, if you might want to think about data literacy as an aspect of citizenship. So algorithms shouldn't be something that's being done by experts to us as citizens. It should be something that, you know, citizens understands that they can be part of that critical appraisal, so that they can kind of contribute to feedback about whether this is a good model, whether the right data is going into it, and whether any assumptions have been made. And I think that kind of improving or supporting that data literacy as an aspect of citizenship can also help build trust in the system itself. Which brings me to the last main idea, which is that the system itself must be trusted. It's not about one algorithm, but about the system as a whole. So again, are the institutions that govern the use of that data or the application of that algorithm, are they fit for purpose? Even if they are fit for purpose, are they perceived to be fit for purpose? Are they trusted by all the communities whose data is being used or who might be affected by how that data is then used? Because if that trust in the kind of in the robustness and the integrity of the institutions isn't there, and that will limit the extent to which those algorithms can be used in society, rightly so. We also need to consider the organizational culture of a place that's maybe developing algorithms for use. So what are their ways of working? Are people empowered and collaborative? If they are not, can you be sure that the data or its models are being properly interrogated? If it's a very kind of conformist culture or falling into line, how are they going to handle critical opinions? Do they have that social diversity or the diversity of skills in order to critique the work properly? So at the ODI, we're passionate about data, but that's exactly why we take a human-centered approach to data and not a data-centered approach, right? So society, as I said at the start, society is something that is created by people for people, and you've got to start your model building and your kind of your vision with that at the core and also that at the outcome.
Thanks, Millie. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about bias in data sets, because it's something that's come up quite a lot, of course, in the news, but in particular in our Q&A, there's a number of questions which reference, for example, how, you know, facial recognition technology at the moment is notoriously bad at recognizing people of color, for example. So, you know, as everybody on this call knows, what the bias in those systems, it really in terms of accuracy is quite inherent. And as another person points out, part of it is a problem of representation or underrepresentativeness of data sets themselves. Is there other ways that we should be thinking about bias in data and how to mitigate it? And at which stage of your categorization should that come in? Some of it is surely about the people dealing with the data, but some of the bias is, of course, baked into the data set itself, and that's because of structural bias. And how should we be starting to think about that?
Yeah, and maybe also we should be thinking about, well, you know, why is this technology being introduced, right? So again, if you take a human-centered view rather than a data-centric view, technology isn't always the solution, you know? And so it's not a silver bullet, it's not this magic tool that's going to address things. So why is a technological tool being introduced to address this challenge, or, you know, in this kind of, in this system, whether it's the justice system or the health system? So I think that would be a really good starting point, you know, because leaning on an algorithm or, you know, a kind of mathematical or statistical analysis to do a piece of work, it's not just going to reflect biases in the data, it's going to reflect biases in the society itself, right? And until we address those in maybe non-technological ways, then the tools are simply going to reproduce that. So again, thinking about kind of trusted institutions, you know, it's, you know, is this something that could have been addressed, say, with dialogue rather than, you know, an app, for example? So it's that kind of critical thinking about what are we trying to achieve, who's in the problem solving team and the brainstorming team about the development of this technology, what other tools or what other approaches could have been considered.
Great. Thanks, Millie. We're really fortunate that Brent Mittelstadt from the Oxford Internet Institute has been able to join us after all, and just on time. So I might use that as an opening to turn to Brent, because what we were hoping Brent could talk to us a bit about is the notion of explainability in the context of algorithm and of data, of course, and what it would mean for an algorithm to be explainable, and what is the kind of current state of conversation and best practice when it comes to explainability.
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy I was able to join in the end. So I will split this up into 3 different topics. So one would be transparency itself. One would be interpretability or interpretable models, and the other one would be explainability. I'll explain what I mean by those different things in just a moment. Now, in terms of transparency, we can, of course, talk about algorithmic transparency and data transparency, even institutional transparency. And there's a number of mechanisms that we can use to, say, release information to people that are affected by our systems or the services we provide. We can do things like impact assessments, which I assume has been talked about already a little bit, so great. And we can do things like standardized documentation for machine learning models and for training data sets, sort of things like model cards for model reporting or data sheets for data sets. And these are all really good tools to have some sort of standardized disclosure about algorithmic systems and about the data that's used to train them. And they can deal with things like gaps in the data, with bias in the data, and what the data is good for, what it's not good for, what the model is good for, what data set it's been trained on, and so forth. So there's a lot to be discussed there, a lot to unpack in terms of institutional transparency. But what I'm going to focus on is more the interpretability and explainability side. So there, what I'm thinking about, the distinction between interpretable and explainable algorithms would be, an interpretable model would be one where a person with some reasonable level of expertise could look at the model working and be able to tell what it's doing, be able to understand it. Now, that's a very loose definition. I think a lot of the models that we now consider to be interpretable would not actually be interpretable to, say, the person on the street. But if you're an expert in the area, in mathematics or statistics or machine learning, then it very well may make sense to you what the system is doing. So there's a whole branch of research that would be looking at how we make models more interpretable, or how we just make the models themselves less complex and more easily understood for people. And there's a number of very popular methods in there. LIME in particular is one that has gotten a lot of attention over the past several years. Alternatively, what I mean by explainability would be producing an explanation of how an algorithm or how an algorithmic system behaves. So how did that system reach a particular decision? How did it classify a person in a particular way? Basically, how is it behaving, or why is it behaving the way that it is? And so there's a number of methods for producing what you might call case-specific explanations. I've worked on one in particular called counterfactual explanations, where the idea is we tell you what would have needed to be different about you or about your particular case in order to have received a different outcome. And so the classic example we use is you apply for a loan and you are denied the loan, and our explanation would tell you your income is £30,000. If your income had been £40,000, then you would have received the loan. So we're telling you what would have needed to be different, what is the smallest possible change to the world that would have been needed in order for you to get the outcome that you actually desired. So that's our preferred approach. There's a number of other approaches that are doing similar things, sort of case-based explanations. But the thing that I think they have in common, and the thing of what makes something a good explanation, would be a set of 3 criteria. So there's a paper from 2018 or 2019, I can't remember, by an Australian philosopher named Tim Miller, that basically looked at evidence in philosophy and the cognitive sciences and the social sciences about what makes a good explanation, and then how that applies to algorithmic systems. And what he found was that good explanations will be contrastive. So they will do this thing of telling you what would have needed to be different for the thing you expected to happen to have actually happened. They'll need to be selective in the sense of they'll need to deal with a select number of causes for whatever it is you're trying to explain it. And they'll need to be social in the sense of it's not just a one-way exchange of information, but actually you are basically entering a dialogue or some sort of interrogation with the system where you're able to ask questions about the explanation you've been provided. So to me, that's sort of the ideal of what a good explanation will look like. And of course, there's a very vibrant research field right now that's developing new ways of providing those sorts of explanations and providing more interpretable models. But I'll stop there with my opening remarks, and yeah, we can move to questions.
Thanks, Brent. Can you give us an example of where we either have seen that type of explainability, interpretability like put into place, or whether you would have liked to have seen it where it didn't happen? So you weren't here for the start, but I talked about some of the recent, more high profile problems with public sector algorithms. So the A-levels example, the Home Office visa streaming algorithm, or the West Midlands Police deciding not to use the National Data Analytics Solution application. But are there examples of public sector entities that have done it well in terms of explainability or interpretability in the UK or elsewhere? Or is this still a kind of emerging thing that we're trying out?
To me, it's still an emerging thing that we're trying out. I wish my colleague Chris Russell were here, because he really works on this on a day-to-day basis. So I'm sure he has some very good examples within the UK itself. I mean, the A-levels algorithm is certainly one that I would have mentioned if you didn't mention it, because that was a really interesting case, because there was transparency there. There was this very long document published that explained how the algorithm actually worked. And, you know, to some people that was interpretable. They were able to understand how it actually worked. I would argue that's not the best way to explain an algorithm to the general public, who's actually going to understand that document or have the time to read it. But at the very least, it was interpretable to some degree to experts who could then actually explain it in a different way or a simpler way to the rest of us, myself included, that wouldn't understand it. So I think that would have been an opportunity to use a simpler, more interpretable model, so that it could have been, you could have had this sort of participatory design behind it, where, you know, if you're working with an interpretable model, it's much easier to ask the people that will be affected by the system how it should be designed and what it should and should not do. And of course, the classic case from the US with the COMPASS algorithm, the recidivism risk scoring algorithm, that one is sort of famously, it's not officially known, but it's famous for being incredibly simplistic. So there you have a very, very interpretable model that still has, you know, really horrific effects. And so it's just to say, even if you understand, this is something I didn't mention, but even if you understand how a system works, that doesn't then make the system somehow more justifiable or more ethical. You know, systems can still be incredibly problematic, even if we understand perfectly how they work.
Let's stay with that A-levels algorithm for a second. Natalia, is there something that the government has learned from that process and that instance about what's needed or what's missing from the landscape of tools and methodologies for regulators, for public sector bodies, for organizations like Ofqual who are using these technologies? Are you looking at that and thinking, okay, we need to work on developing X, Y, and Z?
So I can't speak to the A-level algorithm itself, just because it wasn't run from my department and we had no influence on how this was conducted. But I can definitely share some of the conclusions that we had in my team following the recent data ethics framework refresh. So I think what we need to remember, and this is really, really key, is that any ethical tools, any algorithmic impact assessment tools are only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the meaningful and impactful data ethics work. And to me, the biggest challenge is to get people to use the tool. Because just having ethical principles within the organization, no matter how good they are, is really, really not enough. And I'm sure Brent can tell you that in much more detail, because he wrote some fantastic papers on that. But I think introducing this culture shift in data and tech is really needed to fully establish ethics as an internal part of this movement. And this applies to the public sector, to the private sector as well. And in terms of the kind of voluntary ethics tools or impact assessments, the real practical change on the ground will only be possible if this ethical guidance is embedded in all data science and data policy processes. And our goal is to do that with the data ethics framework. And what we understood in the recent refresh process is that many guidelines of any kind, any ethical guidance fail because the work ends after the tool is out there. And for us, this is really just the beginning. And we will be working with decision makers, we'll be working with practitioners to ensure that there is awareness and skills to use this resource, and that we document the impact stories, that we get feedback. And this is something that we need to remember, I think, about the algorithmic transparency tools as well. So when designing them, we need to see the bigger picture. And based on the experience from previous ethical frameworks and guides in the public sector, we should map out what kind of organizational change needs to happen to fully embed them in how the public sector operates. And I think the kind of second lesson that we learned is that because tech and data, such a dynamic field, we need our guidance and our tools to reflect that. And we did that with the data ethics framework. So it was first launched in 2016, then we developed it in 2018, and now in 2020, to ensure that it keeps being relevant to how technology and data are changing and the user needs are changing as well. And our implementation plans now include continuous feedback mechanisms. So we introduced a downloadable, editable template that people can use for to share their case studies and impact stories with us. And if based on this new evidence, we identify that there is a need to update the framework again, we will do that. And I think the same applies for algorithmic transparency tools, algorithmic impact assessments. When we build something new, especially in the area that's not a very well established area yet, we need to make sure that there are strong feedback mechanisms built in from the very, very beginning. And we must make sure that those feedback loops work well, because whatever tool we end up producing for algorithms, it will need to be updated and advanced regularly. And my final point is that we really need to change the narrative around ethics and innovation, because the responsible use of data is the backbone of innovation. And I'm sure we all know that here. But what we need to do now is to make sure that everyone else knows that as well. So all the data scientists, all the innovators, no matter in what sector, understand that with more transparency comes more freedom to innovate. And if similarly to what Ashley was saying about the Canadian process, I think especially as the public sector agency, if you develop your tool in the constant dialogue with the public, I think that gives you a much better position to start with, because even if you make mistakes, at least you have the public and you have the experts who are able to point those out and help you as you go. So these are some of the kind of general lessons that I've personally noticed in our process of the data ethics framework. And similarly to what Millie was saying about organizational culture as well and the diversity, I think that's also really essential, and that's also something that we're working on at the Government Digital Service.
Thanks, Natalia. When you say develop your tools in conversation with the public, are there different ways that you think that could be achieved more effectively? I mean, Brent made the point that in the case of the off-qual example, they did put quite a lot of information in the public domain, but that was more of a kind of one-way broadcast rather than a conversational dialogue with the public. What have you seen that's effective, and how do you think government could make that work better in the context of tech and innovation? So
I think there are two kind of main ways. So feedback mechanisms for the tools and portals that we have out there. And if we release any information, we need to make sure that there is a way for the public to kind of come back to us with their concerns. But I also think I'm a big fan of the open government movement, and I think that's what we should really, that's the way we should be working in tech and data. So deliberation and participation. and encouraging better public participation through citizen assemblies, citizen juries, planning cells, citizen dialogues. This is something that hasn't been done that much yet. So there were really successful citizen assemblies in the UK, but not focused on tech. And Australia, for example, they ran their whole AI and data ethics principles process through the citizen assembly model. And I think this would be a fantastic way to really understand what the people think about those tools and what we can do better.
I completely agree with you. We're running a citizens jury at the moment at the Ada Lovelace Institute on biometrics technology and facial recognition. We're finding it incredibly fruitful. Just one more question before we move to the other panelists. I'm completely with you on the kind of public deliberation angle. It does seem to me that the baseline to enable that type of consultation has to be some minimum information disclosure in order to really get to a point of deliberation. So how useful do you think things like a public registry of algorithms or algorithmic technologies in the public sector could be in providing that minimum baseline of disclosure to the public?
I think it could absolutely be useful. And you know, just to bring up the example of the recent NHS X COVID app. So I think the way that they kind of provided all the information on their website is really helpful for a user. So as a citizen, I can go on the website, look it up, and kind of read what's happening if I download the app. And I think they've done that really well. And in terms of having some sort of a central register of all algorithms, I think that would be extremely useful. But you know, I can't speak to how feasible that is. The government is is a huge and complex institution. So that's something that we will be exploring in terms of whether that's possible at all, and if not, then what can we do instead? But at this point, I quite frankly don't know. So
yeah. Well, that's great to hear that it's something you'll be exploring. Ashley, I wanted to pick up on, you talked about auditing algorithms against standards. And I think that algorithmic audits are another really interesting mechanism for transparency and accountability as well. I wondered what your experiences have been at AI Global in making those type of audits like work in practice. And I was thinking, as you were talking about it, I was thinking about the challenges of auditing against like subjective standards and how you go about that. So in the case of the A-level algorithm, again, for example, and someone made this point in the Q&A, in fact, there wasn't really anything wrong with the algorithm itself, even though that's how it's been communicated in some circles. But actually, it was really a question of how the algorithm was optimized for and what the definition of fairness deployed by Ofqual was. You know, they were optimizing for fairness across different generations of students, fairness with past results, fairness with future results, and an equal distribution of marks across a spectrum, which is a, you know, arguably legitimate way to optimize an algorithm. But of course, the public felt differently because of individual issues of fairness, which were quite stark and pronounced in particular for certain groups. And so how that seems to me to be a kind of objective judgment that they've made, and that's why some people have said this is not, the A-levels problem wasn't about algorithms, it's about policy and policy making. But as an organization dedicated to kind of standardization and then assessing against compliance against standards, how do you kind of think about those issues about how do you define fairness and how do you assess whether an algorithm is fair or not fair?
Yeah, no, it's really complex. And I think a couple of things, again, context setting is super important in this because it's really easy to talk about a lot of this stuff in a super high level and say, we want diversity and we want transparency. And yes to all of those things. I think though that as with everything, the devil's always in the details. And so a detail that's important just in terms of situating the work that I do is we're not actually trying to develop standards. We're trying to get organizations like IEEE and ISO to finish their standards work. And so we work with alongside, but we would like to point to those because they already have existing mechanisms to create and establish those. I think that though governments establishing standards as well, whether that be for internal use or external use, is something I think we should come back to on this panel. But I'll put it aside for right now. But I do, so what we're trying to do though is to that point exactly, that it's not necessarily just about the algorithm, or it's not about just the data. It's that, and I'll go back to this, what I said earlier, it's also that process that's included as well. And having open public disclosure, and to what degree, is a really important conversation or standard that needs to be established within within these dialogues, and that all three of those need to be thought about together when doing these types of audits or assessments. So to the point that you just made about A-level, if there was transparency, but it was only one way, then that's just it, and it led to further problems, then that's not acceptable. And so this was the idea that we had around, and that's the difference, I would say, between consultation and notification. And so looking at those types of things is what needs to be included in an audit. And that's what we've included in the, well, we call it a trust index. The open source version that I shared in the chat, or to one of the questions, is called the Responsible AI Design Assistant. But that's the idea, is that it is, and one could say in the absence of standards, it's setting standards. I just really hesitate to do that because I don't think that they're great. I think it's a start. And I really liked what Natalia was saying about this being an iterative process. So just to cover myself, I don't think that they're great standards, but I do think that it's starting to take all of those various different components together. And that's what ISO and IEEE aren't doing, is they make individual discrete standards that work for particular contexts. And that's super important. But to be able to think about all of those things together, I think that's where an audit comes in. And even when we think about audits, I was actually on a panel, or a 2-day workshop, a forum with the US Comptroller General's office last week. And it was super interesting because somebody asked the question even about, well, what do we mean by audits, and which phase in the life cycle is it? And so are they looking to be proactive? Are they looking and preventative? Therefore, are they reactive and saying like, A-level, no, now you need to do this, and then there's changes for the next version of it? So I would argue that they need to happen all the way throughout, and they need to have all of those components of looking at the inputs to the algorithm itself and how it's being defined. Because as we know, we're just putting our own biases into the creation of those algorithms. And that's what Brent was talking about with Compass. And then also, and within that, what are the mechanisms that we can do to assess against those pieces? And so Brent talks about counterfactuals in some of his research. Others look at proxy data, or even just the amount of data that needs to be put in. So these are all types of things that I think an audit is not, especially if you're thinking about it from a preventative perspective, it's not to be a gotcha compliance tool. It's meant to be a thing that you can start to have that dialogue within. And what we found in the work that we're doing with the Trust Index is that organizations are using it, and it's starting to stimulate discussions that they didn't have previously. So whether that's because their business team and their technology team are now interacting, or they hadn't thought about any sort of mitigation measures or ongoing monitoring, or the tech team had a very different perspective on what unintended consequences could exist versus the business team. So all these types of things, I think when I think about an audit, I'm really thinking about it through that entire life cycle, and also that it does have some of those standards, and we can't build all of those. So where we can, we're just pointing to them as much as possible. And some of those right now are just in the best practice phase, and that's okay too. And some of these things that we're talking about could be the distinction, if we had these audits that were followed and they were mandatory in place, the distinction between notification and actual dialogue or consultation. And so that's where I see that being. And just not to your question, but I do think one thing I'd really like to have other people respond to also is just, we're talking a lot about the government's job in terms of government deployed algorithms. And I think that that's really important. But I do, and this is something that I fought for a lot in my previous role, is that there needs to be that same consistency when we think about regulations of external companies. So the government does those two things. We provide services and then also regulate. And I think that the same rules need to be applied when we're looking outward as well. And so for two reasons. One is like, why should there be a different level of service to the public? But two, there should just really be the same like standards held, because and for the most part, governments aren't actually making their own. We're procuring them from other organizations, and so, or other companies that are developing these things. And so just to have those same consistent rules apply, even make that a lot easier.
Yeah, thank you. That was super interesting, Ashley, and both Brent and Millie want to come in to respond to some of the things you've said, but thank you for pointing out, and I was going to turn to it. Some of the Q&As have been on this exact question, which is in particular on big tech companies and platforms, but also in respect to smaller companies building algorithms. How should we think about transparency around their algorithmic systems? And how should, well, this is a question I'll add to that. How do we think about government audit or assessment of private sector algorithms, in particular when, as you point out, Ashley, they're procuring those algorithms or using them and don't have access to kind of black boxed systems? You know, what types of access should we expect that they should have? And I think some of the Q&As questions came up in the context of online harms, where here in the UK there is this idea being floated that the new regulator for online harms, which will be Ofcom, will have some ability to do some auditing of platforms, algorithms. And so what should that look like, and how to make a reality? But I'll come in first to Brent and then to Millie, who both wanted to follow up on some of the things that Ashley was saying.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the question of whether this is a technology problem or a policy and government problem. And I think that points to something really, really important around when we're thinking about how to audit these systems, is when we're deciding on what something like fairness or equality means, the power to define that, practically speaking, rests with whoever is defining the requirements for the system. So typically with the big tech company or whoever it is that's actually developing the system. And that definition really needs to be interrogated by whoever is procuring it. I think going forward, what would be really useful to do is to very clearly distinguish between the sorts of work we expect the developer of the system to do in terms of supporting auditing, and the sort of work that we expect whoever's procuring the system to do. And ideally, if we're thinking about how to define or measure, say, fairness or equality in a system, the people making that decision would be a body with democratic legitimacy to do so. So I've done some work recently thinking about how equality is defined in the context of non-discrimination law, and there a lot of the work is done by the courts, basically interpreting the law and what the concept means in practice. But I think that's really, really illuminating to look at. Because what the developer should be doing is supporting that interpretive work that's done by the court routinely, rather than doing it themselves. And I think what we have right now is that interpretive work is actually being done by the developers themselves. So what we proposed in this piece of work I'm thinking of is basically a standardized form of statistical evidence that could be produced by systems to help the judiciary interpret, the case or the law, the facts of the case. You can apply this to other, regulatory bodies if you want to, and help the people that are affected by the system to actually interpret what is happening. Say, for example, in figuring out which sorts of groups are actually being disadvantaged by the system. So not doing the interpretive part, but rather just producing consistent evidence so somebody else can do the interpretive part. I feel like we haven't made that distinction clearly in terms of our expectations around procurement of systems. And if we do that, then that will actually have a lot of knock-on effects that would solve, well, maybe not solve, but would certainly go towards solving some of the issues we're seeing around bias and fairness.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks, Brent. Millie also wanted to address the question of the inevitability of bias. Should I turn to you, Millie?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, so the theme of bias in the data sets or in the way algorithms are developed is coming up a lot. And I just wanted to say that, bias is inevitable. It's inevitable in knowledge. It's inevitable in human knowledge, simply because we're flawed and complete information is not possible either for us to grasp or to understand. But there's this wonderful kind of analogy in philosophy and epistemology, which is a theory of knowledge. It's called von Neurath's ship. So the idea is that you're in this ship and it's in the middle of the ocean and it sets sail, and then you discover a hole in the hold. So you patch up the hole in the hold with wood from the deck, but now you've got a hole in the deck. So you patch up the hole in the deck with wood from the mast, but now you've got a hole in the mast. So you're trying to repair the ship as you're sailing in the middle of the ocean. ideally you'd not have a ship with holes in it, but that's what you've got. So what do? Do you go back to shore and start again? You can't do that. You're in the middle of the ocean. You just keep trying to get to where you're going and stay afloat for as long as you can with the flawed ship that you have, right? And that's how we approach theory of knowledge and philosophy. We know we can never have perfect knowledge. So then I think with that, I guess the main point is, with that, there should come a humility about the knowledge that we have, to know that it's flawed despite our best efforts. It's always going to be flawed. And so have, what Natalia was saying about those built-in systems, that iterative, adaptive way to kind of keep reviewing, keep reflecting, never present it as complete, but always present it as a work in progress. And also with the humility to listen to those who are affected by it. And again, Aristotle says, there's never solutions in ethics or politics, because each solution will create new problems. So you've got to commit to this for the long term, not just here's a solution, it's done. You've got to keep that conversation open. And that means having the humility and the trust in the interlocutors to maintain that. So in practical terms, away from the kind of big picture philosophy, I guess I'd say, well, what are the processes for addressing any harms? Or mitigating the consequences of that bias? Are the processes robust, and are the proposed mitigations or reparations, are they adequate? Okay, that comes back to the power relation between, as Brent was saying, those who decide what's implemented and those who are affected by it. So again, who's deciding that and who's determining that? And finally, do we have shared goals or a shared understanding about the purpose of this tool? And if there isn't that shared vision, then maybe the tool should not be introduced. And just other people have mentioned the A-levels controversy. I'd like to suggest that maybe one reason that kind of was so controversial here was because of what the A-levels in Britain represent in terms of social mobility, right? And in terms of access to higher education and life chances. And that's not the fault of the technology. That's a wider systemic problem, but it's also a cultural issue. And again, so any, bringing technology into something like this is simply going to expose what's already there.
That's great. Thanks, Millie. There are two other questions on bias from the audience, but I think you and Brent have addressed them, but I'll read them out anyway, because I think they just chime with what you've said. One asked, since bias is described as a derivation from the norm, how do you define the norm, and who's involved in defining the norm? Who gets to define and approve the norm? And I think that comes to some of the points that Brent made. And the other was, to Millie's point, we can't expect an algorithm to be more perfect than human decision making in terms of zero bias and perfectly ethical. So if we don't expect that, how then do we measure the outcome of full algorithmic? What is the measurable outcome of full algorithmic transparency if it's not about eradicating bias? I think to Millie's point there, how can we, what can we measure and check and approve through the process system to mitigate any harms? I think there's a couple of overarching questions that I might just put to the group as a whole to see if anyone particularly wants to come into them. One is, what role do the panel think pilots have in ensuring that algorithms are fit for purpose? And have we seen any particular good examples of pilots being effective in this case? Another person asked whether algorithms themselves could be involved in algorithmic auditing or transparency. Can we imagine an algorithm to audit algorithms? There is a question here. In the private sector, which parts of the business do you foresee should manage auditing and impact assessment? Is it a job for compliance? Is it a new company department? Is it a policy and comms team? Is it a job for external accredited consultants? So I think very practical questions about how do we put some of these things into practice. And then I think there are some interesting questions about communicating about algorithms and data from the perspective of government. So has the reputation of algorithms been harmed through the A-level scandal, for example, and how should we think better about communicating about these types of systems? What should we tell people about algorithmic systems? I think that the phrase used by Boris Johnson was quite unhelpful, this idea of a mutant algorithm, as if it's an agent in and of itself that's going around making decisions and not the result of human decision making. But how should we, how can we improve that? Somebody points out, for example, that government hasn't been very good historically at communicating to the public about false positives and false negatives. And so rather than saying something works 100% of the time or doesn't work, can we be more nuanced in our communicating about algorithms to the public, and might that improve public trust? And perhaps, through the experience of COVID, the public have gotten slightly better at understanding risks and trade-offs in the context of public policy than they have been previously. So those are some of the questions floating around. What I might do is turn back to each of the panelists for some final thoughts. And if you want to address any of those questions, please do. But otherwise, I'd be interested in your thoughts on where this goes to next. Maybe Natalia, we'll start with you. New Zealand has produced standards for how public agencies should use algorithms. Canada, of course, has had implemented the system that Ashley had previously worked on. Is there something that internationally that the UK government wishes to follow, or is it the case of coming up with a new set of tools that the UK itself will deploy in this field, and where do you see this going next?
So we definitely don't want to reinvent the wheel. And I think it's really important to be in the dialogue with other governments that have successfully implemented similar measures. And the Canadian example is the kind of the most prominent one, the one that everyone was really excited about. And actually, I'm actually trying to get in touch with some of your ex-colleagues to have this conversation. So I would say we will definitely take the kind of learnings from other governments, and we will see what are the things that we need to really look at in the UK, and based on this and all the wealth of knowledge that is being produced here domestically as well, with all the great organizations, including the organizations that my fellow panelists represent as well, we'll be trying to find the best option. And I can probably speak a little bit to some of the questions about how the government is communicating the work and the kind of perception of algorithms. So I think what we've seen with COVID is that the pandemic brought the data ethics conversation to the mainstream, and I personally think this is a really positive development because it enables a more active public participation in decisions related to data, and it really increased the understanding of data protection, responsibility, innovation, data ethics, and I hope that this change in perception will also lead to people being more engaged with how we make decisions in data policy. Because now this rise of awareness gives people more agency, and they now know more and are more demanding recipients of the data that we release and the data projects that we produce, and they're ready to hold us accountable. And I personally think this is great. And doing the work to proactively increase transparency in how we use algorithms at this very moment in history, I think it's very timely, and it will enable us to continue this conversation right now when we've seen what are the things that can happen if we don't do this properly. So I think really what we need is to have a more two-sided conversation with the public, and this is something that we're trying to work at now. And personally, I think it's great that we're now talking to a more aware and more informed audience, and the kind of criticism that various algorithmic projects have been getting. It might be, of course, it's negative, but I think the position we're in, that we have this strong civil society and we have the public to point out our mistakes, I think that's good, because this is the start of having those feedback mechanisms on a very large scale. So overall, I'm being optimistic.
Super, thank you. Ashley, what about you? Are you optimistic or pessimistic? And do you have any final thoughts that you want to share?
I don't know. It's early. I don't know if I'm optimistic or pessimistic.
You're just tired. You're just tired.
I was listening to Natalia being like, actually just thinking like, I'm so pessimistic in comparison to you. So I think maybe it's a relative term. But more so just on the implementation. I think overall, I always skew to being optimistic, or else why would we do the work that we're doing? So of course, I think that there's a lot of hope for how we can make an impact. And I think that inherently people aren't bad. And I really don't think that all companies are bad. I think that there's just a lot of lack of understanding and people living in their little bubbles of what they want to achieve and those goals not being aligned. And so I think that what Millie was talking about of having a shared vision and for the future and where we want to go is a really important dialogue that we need to have. And I think that I really hope that we've learned from COVID. In Canada, we've been less, it hasn't been as significant. It hasn't been good. But I don't know that people's behavior is going to change. And that's where I think maybe I'm a little bit more pessimistic, because I've seen how that there was an initial kind of trajectory towards awareness, and then people kind of just got tired and are just doing whatever they want for the most part, or need to. So it's not, anyway, so not to get into that too much, but I don't know that there's going to be a ton of change from that. And I do think, though, that as much as I come from the open government world, I built Canada's first open government portal. I built one of the first ones for the city of Edmonton in Canada in general. Like that's my roots. But I think it's not, open government is not if you build it, they will come scenario. And I think we need to remember that for these public dialogues as well, is that there needs to be a degree of awareness and a degree of understanding of the impact that it's going to have in order for people to actually meaningfully participate in these public dialogues. And I think that there needs to be something like citizen juries where it's a little bit more mandatory, and you have to have good methodology to make sure that you're getting a good cross section. So I'm happy with the slew of questions that came in to just address them very quickly, a couple of them. I do think that when we go into practical implementation, it does need to be a hybrid right now of public and private governance, for some of the reasons that I mentioned earlier, just the cross borders, looking at this as a more global initiative, but also starting to get to some of those standards that Brent's talking about, or even technical standards like I was talking about earlier. In order to do that, I don't know that it's one particular government's job solely. And so I think that blend, which is why the work that I'm doing now in creating an audit is working to lead to the creation of a certification mark. And that's an independent authoritative certification mark, or a kite mark, sorry, in the UK. But not done as a service, done through an accreditation program. And I think that's an important distinction. And so thinking about those kind of concepts together, I think that when the public is going to be impacted by this, then they also need to be brought into that dialogue as well. And so this idea of taking from bioethics, having people be part of that process. And I don't mean for like just pharmaceutical testing, but testing in general, and doing kind of, and giving that feedback. One of the questions that you raised, Carly, was around pilots. I think that we can do it within that mechanism for sure. So optimistic overall in that I think the fact that we're having this dialogue and it's a continued conversation. The Social Dilemma just came out on Netflix, which I think is great that it's kind of making a mainstream splash. So hopefully from that, there will be, combined with what's happened with COVID, there will be kind of a greater awareness. But I do think that it does need to be this blend of private and public, and private corporations need to take a stronger role in this, and that there actually needs to be regulation against them, not just self-assessment. I'll stop there.
That's really comprehensive. Thanks so much, Ashley. Millie, do you want to respond to any of those questions or pick up anything Ashley said?
Yeah, so just briefly, just some headlines. There was a question or a comment about the role of pilots. And yes, I think they're really important. They're really useful. And it's important to also state that, local government has a role here. It's not just central government and nationwide initiatives. But at the same time, we've got to make sure that the distribution of pilots is equitable, so that the kind of both the distribution of the benefits or the risks are distributed fairly, and not just kind of one community or one region or one social group continuously getting the benefits of emerging technology. In terms of being optimistic or pessimistic, I think I'm meta optimistic, because I think even when there's a controversy, it's really great for raising public awareness of the issues and getting them involved and kind of engaged with this. I'd just say that I guess it's important that the way the debate is framed and conceptualized is accurate and responsible. Otherwise, if the public understanding of the issue is not clear, then it could actually inhibit, say, research or innovation. So it's really important that there's that the understanding of what's going on is accurate and responsible, and that's the basis of discussion about the rights and wrongs of policy or implementation and so on. And that comes back to my earlier point about sort of data literacy as part of citizenship, right? In the same way that kind of, linguistic literacy is needed, for example, to vote and so on. I think a certain amount of data literacy is going to become increasingly important as part of being a citizen. Finally, just the way forward. So at the ODI, we're doing some work on data institutions. Actually, today, we've got a day-long conference on data institutions, and it's exactly that, models of governance, models of community participation, and so on, addressing power asymmetries and so on. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that.
That's great. Thank you so much, Millie. And to round us up, Brent, there's a minute remaining. So any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, just two real quick ones. One is that I've detected a feeling of, let's say, ethics fatigue in the past couple of months around AI ethics. And I just wanted to say that if somebody comes to you and tells you, we don't have the right principles or we don't have the right framework, then you can absolutely ignore them at this point. But what we should not do is abandon the sort of work that's being done by the other members of this panel, where it's actually real serious grounded work. I mean, nobody said ethics was going to be easy. Nobody said, Rome was going to be built in a day. This is exactly the sort of difficult, time-consuming work that ethics takes to be done properly. So very, very happy to see that that's being done. And just to wrap things up, the question that we had about is it reasonable to expect algorithms to be perfect in terms of zero bias and perfectly ethical? No, of course not. I mean, you can't expect that of anything, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't hold these systems to a higher standard. They create an opportunity for us to understand our own biases better and also to make positive changes at a social level. And if we only hold algorithms to the same standard we've held ourselves historically, all that's going to do is end up upholding the status quo, which isn't great for everybody. So I think we really need to think about how we can use algorithms in a more, let's say, active sense in terms of identifying and fixing bias than we have historically.
Thank you, Brent. That's the perfect way to round up this conversation. Thank you all for such a really thoughtful and nuanced take on these issues. I think we really went deep on some of them, so I appreciate your time. Thank you all for sticking with us. The majority of people did stay for the whole hour and a half, which is an impressive commitment, so thank you for that. And I hope that you can, ways to follow up with each of the panelists if you need to. The UK IGF Twitter account has tagged all of us in their most recent tweets, so you can go there if you want to follow up with any of the speakers individually. But otherwise, I will hand back to Sheetal and the IGF crew, and thank you all very much for your time.